If you are new to Quiet Stories of Faith, welcome. We are glad you're here. Take your time, look through the library. There are many more stories where this one came from. Stories from history, from scripture, from the unexplained corners of the world. All told slowly at night for people who want the last thing they think about before sleep to be something worth thinking about. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. Now we will begin tonight's story. There is a kind of faith that does not announce itself. It does not stand on rooftops and declare its presence to the crowds. It does not demand signs or wait for the dramatic fulfillment of a promised blessing before it begins to act. It does not require certainty or guarantee or visible evidence that what it is doing will ever matter. It simply moves quietly in the direction of what is good, what is generous, and what honors something larger than itself. And in that quietness, without any awareness that history is watching, it sets in motion forces that will reshape everything. Ancient Israel was a land accustomed to the dramatic. Its people had witnessed plagues fall upon their enemies. They had watched the sea pull apart like a curtain drawn back by invisible hands. They had eaten bread that appeared each morning on the desert ground and did not understand where it came from. They had seen fire descend on altars drenched in water and consume not just the wood and the animal laid upon it, but the very stones beneath. This was a people whose entire national identity was built on the premise that the God they served was capable of intervening in history in ways that shattered every expectation. But by the time the events of this story unfold, something had shifted. The northern kingdom of Israel had splintered away from its southern counterpart generations earlier, and the long, slow erosion of faithfulness had begun. Kings rose and fell, most of them leading their people further from the practices and the consciousness that had once made the nation extraordinary. The prophets still moved through the land, teachers, reformers, voices crying in the ordinary streets of ordinary towns. But their presence was increasingly unwelcome in the courts of power. They were tolerated on the margins, consulted occasionally in desperation, and mostly ignored by those who had decided that older, more accommodating gods suited their political ambitions better. Into this landscape walked Elisha, the son of Shaphat, the successor of the great prophet Elijah. He was not the kind of man who drew attention through dramatic self-presentation. He wore no crown. He commanded no army. He had no political alliance that made him useful to anyone in the rooms where decisions were made. What he had was a presence, a quality of consciousness that those with eyes to see recognized immediately. Not because he announced it, but because it was simply there. The way warmth is present in a room before you can name the source. He traveled. This was what prophets did. They moved through the land, teaching in the towns, offering counsel where it was wanted, carrying with them whatever it was that set them apart from ordinary men. And it was on one of these travels that his road took him through a town called Shunem, a small place in the territory of Issachar, sitting in the fertile valley of Jezreel, where the grain grew well and the land had always been generous to those who worked it. And in Shunem there lived a woman. She is never named in the text. Not once across the entire account of what happens to her does anyone refer to her by name. She is identified only by where she lives and by what she does, which is perhaps more significant than any name could have been. She is identified by her actions, and her actions tell us everything we need to know. The text calls her a great woman, and this word in the Hebrew carries layers of meaning that a simple translation cannot fully capture. It suggests wealth, certainly. The narrative makes clear that her household is prosperous, that her husband is a man of means, that she has servants and resources at her disposal. But the word also carries connotations of significance, of weight, of a person whose presence in a community is felt in ways that go beyond material circumstances. She was great in the sense that she occupied meaningful space in the life of those around her. She was a person who mattered, and she was perceptive. This is perhaps the quality the narrator most wants us to understand about her, because it is the quality that sets everything in motion. On the day that Elisha passed through Shunem for the first time, she saw him, not merely noticed him, saw him. She looked at this traveling teacher and perceived something about him that others might have missed entirely. She recognized without being told, without any introduction or credential or formal announcement, that this man was set apart in some way, that the thing she sensed in his presence was not ordinary. She called him a holy man of God, and this was her own private assessment formed in the moment of encounter, requiring no external confirmation. This is a remarkable detail. Faith traditions throughout history have produced countless accounts of dramatic supernatural encounters, visions, voices, visitations that arrive with unmistakable force and leave no room for uncertainty. But the Shunammite woman's recognition of Elisha required none of that. It was quiet, interior, perceptive. She read the room, so to speak, and understood something about the man that his outer circumstances did not obviously reveal. This is the first indication of who she is, a person of unusual spiritual sensitivity, capable of seeing beneath the surface of things to whatever is actually present beneath them. And having seen, she acted. Section 2. Hospitality without expectation. The ancient world understood hospitality as a sacred obligation. In cultures where travel was dangerous, where the roads between towns offered little shelter, and where strangers were entirely dependent on the goodwill of those they encountered, the practice of welcoming guests was not simply a social courtesy. It was a moral and religious duty. To feed a traveler, to offer rest, to provide shelter for even one night was considered an act of profound significance, carrying with it a weight of meaning that modern sensibility surrounded by hotels and restaurants and transportation networks can barely reconstruct. The woman of Shunem understood this, but what she did went beyond the minimum that cultural expectation would have required. The text says that she urged him, that word suggesting not a casual offer, but an insistence, a pressing, a genuine desire to provide, rather than merely to fulfill an obligation. Elisha was passing through her town, and she stopped him. She brought him into her home and she fed him, and from that first encounter forward, whenever his travels brought him through Shunem, he stopped there to eat. A rhythm was established, a pattern, something that might have been easy to overlook in the accounting of dramatic events was quietly developing in this ordinary town between this unnamed woman and this traveling prophet, a relationship built on consistent, unrequested generosity. But she wanted to do more. At some point, she went to her husband with a proposal. This detail matters. She did not act alone. She spoke to her husband, presented her reasoning, and sought his agreement. The text gives us her words, and they are striking in their practical clarity. She told him that she had perceived that this man who passed by them regularly was holy, a man of God, and therefore she proposed that they should build him a room, not just offer him a meal when he happened to be passing, but create a permanent place, a physical structure dedicated to his use whenever his journeys brought him through Shunem. The room she proposed was small but complete, a bed so he could sleep in comfort, a table so he could work or eat, a lamp so he could read or write in the evening hours, a chair so he could sit without standing. These four things are enumerated in the text with a specificity that feels almost domestic in its attention to detail. This woman was not thinking in grand gestures. She was thinking about what a man would actually need. What would make his rest genuine rest? What would make his study productive? What would make his time in their home something more than merely adequate? She thought about this carefully. She planned it. She convinced her husband, and then they built it. There is something important to notice here. At no point in the planning or the building or the welcoming of Elisha into this specially prepared room does the woman make any mention of what she hopes to receive in return. She does not hint at a need she has. She does not frame her generosity as an investment in future blessing. She does not approach the preparation of the room with any agenda beyond the straightforward desire to serve someone she recognizes as being connected to something larger than the ordinary. This is hospitality in its purest form. Service given freely without calculation, without the quiet ledger keeping that so often runs beneath even our most generous actions. She is not building the room so that God will notice and reward her. She is not serving the prophet so that the prophet will owe her something. She is acting out of a quality of character that has not yet encountered the need that will make her generosity's significance apparent. She is simply being who she is, doing what her perception and her values move her to do, in the quiet assumption that this is simply how one lives. The room was completed. Elisha came and rested there. And for a time, this was the whole of the story. A woman who acted generously, a prophet who received with gratitude, and a small upper room in a prosperous household in Shunem that became a regular stopping point on a traveling man's road. Then Elisha asked a question. He called his servant Gehazi and told him to summon the woman. When she stood before him, he said, "You have gone to all this trouble for us. What can be done for you?" And then he asked whether she might like him to speak on her behalf to the king or to the commander of the army, whether there was some political favor or official intercession that she desired, some door in the halls of power that she wanted him to open for her. Her answer was immediate and complete. She told him that she dwelt among her own people. This simple phrase carried within it a self-sufficiency, a contentment, a sense that she had what she needed and was not reaching for anything beyond it. She was not performing modesty. She was not strategically refusing in the hope that a greater offer would follow. She meant it. She was a woman who in the deepest sense was at peace with what she had and who had extended her generosity not as a purchase, but as an expression of that peace. Elisha listened, and then he turned to Gehazi and asked what could be done for her. And it was Gehazi who said the thing that Elisha's question had not reached. "She has no son," he said, "and her husband is old." The woman had not mentioned this. Not once in all the interactions described to this point had she raised the subject of what was absent from her life. Whatever she carried in private, whatever ache accompanied the recognition that she had material abundance and a kind husband in a prosperous household, and still lacked the thing that her culture considered the most essential mark of a woman's fullness and purpose, she had kept that quietly within herself. She had not made it the center of her interactions with Elisha. She had not used her hospitality as a bargaining chip for the blessing she most needed. But Gehazi saw it, and having seen it, he told his master. Section 3. A promise unexpected. There is a kind of hope that becomes too dangerous to hold when something has been wanted long enough and not received. When the absence of it has been accommodated and rationalized and finally painfully accepted as simply the shape of one's life. The prospect of hope arriving unexpectedly is not always experienced as joy. Sometimes it is experienced as danger because to hope again means to be vulnerable again to the specific pain of not receiving. And that is a pain that once survived, one does not approach carelessly. The woman of Shunem had made peace with her childlessness. This was not the peace of someone who had never wanted anything different. It was the harder peace of someone who had wanted and waited and eventually organized her interior life around an acceptance of what was. She had a husband, though he was old. She had prosperity, which she used generously. She had a community among whom she dwelt with apparent belonging. She had her faith expressed in the way she lived. She had, by the standards of any honest accounting, a life of meaning and richness. And she had learned to hold that meaning and richness without making it contingent on the things she did not have, which is why when Elisha called her to stand in the doorway of the room they had built for him and told her that at this season of the following year she would embrace a son, she pushed back. "Do not lie to your servant," she said. "This is not the response of a woman without faith. This is the response of a woman who has experienced the specific grief of hope, deferred long enough that she has learned to protect herself from false comfort." She was not telling Elisha that she doubted his power. She was telling him that she could not afford to let herself believe something that might not happen, that the cost of hoping and being disappointed was one she had already paid and could not easily pay again. But notice what she did not do. She did not argue further. She did not demand a sign or a guarantee. She did not refuse the word. She simply expressed with honest directness the fragility that lay beneath her composed exterior. And then she went back to her life. And the next year at the appointed time, she conceived and bore a son, exactly as the word had said, exactly on the schedule the prophet had named. The fulfillment of the promise was precise, unhurried, and complete. There is a quality to this kind of fulfillment that defies adequate description. When something you had surrendered returns, when a hope you had buried out of self-protection begins to breathe again, the joy of it carries within it the memory of the grief. And this combination of past loss and present arrival makes the experience more layered, more complex, and ultimately more meaningful than a straightforward answered prayer could have been. She had waited. She had stopped waiting. She had organized her life without the things she once wanted. And now it was here, small and new and utterly real in her arms. Her son grew. This is all the text tells us about the years that followed. He grew, which is to say, time passed, which is to say, the miracle settled into ordinary life and became the background against which everyday moments unfolded. He was not a miracle to be observed from a distance. He was a child to be fed and held and taught, a presence that filled the rooms of the house and the interior of his mother's heart with a particular kind of weight that only something long desired and finally received can carry. She had heard the impossible and received it, and for a while that was everything. Section 4. The miracle becomes ordinary life. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. To truly attend to something, to be fully present to it without the distortions of agenda, anxiety, or habit, is to give it the most complete gift available to a conscious being. And the woman of Shunem had been attentive from the beginning. She had attended to Elisha with the careful, undemanding attention of someone who sees clearly and acts on what she sees. And now she attended to her son with a particular quality of presence that only a parent who has waited long for a child can offer. The miracle had become, as all genuine miracles eventually do, simply the texture of daily life. There is no tragedy in this. It is in fact the natural completion of what miracles are for. Not to remain extraordinary, indefinitely suspended in a state of perpetual astonishment, but to become integrated into the fabric of living, to shape the structure of ordinary days in ways that are no longer startling, but deeply real. The child born of promise and prophecy was now simply a child, with all the mundane reality that childhood involves. He ran in the fields. He watched his father's workers. He breathed the morning air of the Jezreel Valley and knew nothing of the negotiations that had surrounded his arrival except through whatever his mother in her wisdom chose to tell him. Years passed in the household at Shunem. The upper room still stood. Elisha still came when his travels brought him through. The relationship between the prophet and the woman who had prepared a place for him continued in the quiet rhythm that hospitality had established. And beneath it all, the consciousness that had animated her original generosity, the attentiveness, the perception, the capacity to see what was present and respond to it without calculation, remained the dominant quality of her character. She did not know what was coming. None of them did. The fields were warm in the season of harvest. The workers moved through the grain with the efficient precision of people who have done this work many times before, their bodies carrying the knowledge that seasons of labor had written into muscle and movement. The child was there among his father and the reapers, present in the way that children are present in working fields, alert, curious, moving between the adults with the easy freedom of someone who belongs to the landscape. And then something happened. The child reached up toward his father and said, "My head, my head." Two words repeated, pain that does not have more language than its own announcement. The child's body registering something wrong with the only vocabulary available to it, the name of the place where the wrong was happening. His father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother. This is a detail worth holding." The father's response was not alarm, not panic, not the immediate recognition that something catastrophic was occurring. He sent the child to his mother, which suggests that whatever the father understood in that moment, it was not yet translated as emergency. It was something that could be addressed by bringing the child indoors, by maternal care, by the remedies that a household applied to the ordinary sufferings of children. The servant carried him to his mother. She took him and held him on her knees, and he sat there through the morning hours, the pain behind his eyes or inside his skull unrelenting. And sometime around midday, the child died in her arms, in the house built on the miracle of his own arrival, in the arms of the woman who had been told by a prophet at the doorway of a room she had built as an act of pure generosity that she would embrace a son. Section 5. Sudden tragedy. Grief that arrives without preparation is a particular kind of violence. There are losses that come with warning that allow the slow withdrawal of the future, the gradual reordering of expectation that makes the final arrival of absence more bearable, if never truly bearable. And then there are losses that arrive mid-sentence, mid-morning, in the middle of an ordinary day, leaving no interval between the living world, the world after it. The child died on his mother's knees on a harvest morning in Shunem, and there was no preparation for it, no gradual understanding, no warning that would have made any difference even had it come. She held him. What happens in the interior of a human being in the first moments after an irreversible loss? In the seconds and minutes immediately after the body against you has stopped responding. After the breath that was, there is not there. After the warmth begins its terrible slow withdrawal. This is something that language has always struggled to contain. Every tradition that has tried to describe it has reached eventually for silence, because the experience is not primarily cognitive. It does not consist of thoughts. It consists of the body's refusal to accept what the body itself is already registering as true. The woman of Shunem held her son. Then she did something extraordinary. She laid him on the bed of Elisha. Think carefully about this action, because it is not obvious. It is not what grief typically produces. Grief usually produces crying out, collapse, or a desperate search for someone to tell, for the comfort of shared horror, for the relief of not being alone with the unbearable. What this woman did instead was carry the body of her dead child upstairs and place it on the bed that she and her husband had built for a prophet. And then she closed the door. She closed the door. She left the child in that room, in the place most associated in her household with the presence of the one who had spoken the impossible word that began all of this. Then she went downstairs and did the next thing. She told her husband to send her one of the servants and one of the donkeys so that she could go to the man of God. Quickly, she said, and return. Her husband asked why she was going. It was not a feast day. It was not a Sabbath, the occasions when such visits were customary. She answered with three words that are among the most remarkable in the entire text. It is well. Three words. In the Hebrew, even fewer than that, an expression meaning peace, wholeness, things being as they should be. She spoke a word of peace into a moment that contained no peace. She answered her husband with a declaration that was not a description of the moment's reality, but an affirmation of something she had decided to believe before the evidence appeared. This was not denial. This was not the hollow cheerfulness of someone too frightened to face what had happened. She knew what had happened. She was the one who had held him as he died. She knew the weight of the child laid on Elisha's bed. She knew exactly how nothing was well in any ordinary sense of the word. What she meant, what her words "it is well" communicated, was something closer to this. I have not yet said the last word about this. I have a place to go and a person to reach, and until I have done those things, I am not willing to call this finished. She saddled the donkey and told her servant to drive fast and not to slow down unless she told him to. She rode toward Mount Carmel, toward wherever Elisha was, with an urgency that the servant could feel in the pace she demanded and the silence she maintained. She was going to the source of the word that had given her the child. She was going with the child's death carried in her chest like an accusation and a plea at the same time. The grief of the thing taken and the demand of the thing promised held together in a faith that refused to separate them. Section 6. Radical Faith Under Pressure. The distance from Shunem to Mount Carmel was not small. Mount Carmel rises from the coastal plain in the northwest of the land, a ridge of limestone and forest that the ancient Israelites had long associated with the presence of the divine. Elijah had once stood there before 450 prophets of Baal and called down fire on a drenched altar. The mountain had a reputation as a place of encounter, a high place in both the geographical and spiritual sense, somewhere the distance between the ordinary world and what lay beyond it was felt to be thinner than usual. It was toward this place that the woman of Shunem directed her servant and her donkey. She drove them at a pace that communicated everything about her state of mind, while her words communicated almost nothing. She had said, "It is well." She was not saying it again. She was riding. Elisha saw her coming from a distance. This detail is significant. It means he was watching. Somewhere in his awareness, the man of God was already attuned to the approach of something that required his attention. He told Gehazi to run and meet her and ask whether she was well, whether her husband was well, whether the child was well. She answered Gehazi with the same words. It is well. But notice what she did next. She kept moving. She did not slow down. She did not stop to explain herself. She passed through Gehazi's question the way someone in a real crisis passes through well-meaning but insufficient responses. She acknowledged the question, but she refused to be derailed by it. She continued toward the only destination that mattered. When she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet. And this was the first sign in the text that the composure she had maintained during the journey was a discipline held over something far more turbulent. The steady riding, the short answers, the refusal to explain herself. All of it had been holding back a grief that could no longer remain contained. Gehazi moved to push her away, as servants sometimes do when they think someone is disrupting an important encounter. But Elisha stopped him. "Let her alone," he said, "for her soul is in bitter distress within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." This moment is unusually honest in a prophetic story. Elisha admitted that he did not know. Whatever spiritual perception he possessed, it had not revealed to him what this woman was carrying. He was responding not to a revelation, but to her arrival, her posture, and the weight of her distress. Her first words were simple and direct. "Did I ask for a son?" she said. "Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" This is lament, an ancient form of prayer found throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, a prayer that does not pretend peace when there is none, a prayer that does not hide pain behind polite language. It speaks directly to the source of the suffering with the honesty of raw human feeling. She was not saying that she had lost faith. She was saying that the gift she never asked for had been given and then taken away. She had once said, "Do not deceive me," when the promise was first spoken. Now she said it again, not as doubt about what was possible, but as grief about what had happened. And after she said it, she waited. Section 7. The urgent journey and what it reveals. Before following Elisha back toward Shunem, it is worth pausing to notice the journey that brought this woman to his feet. She had held a dead child in her arms. She had carried him upstairs, laid him in the prophet's room, and closed the door. Then she told her husband everything was well. She told Gehazi everything was well. And she rode all the way from Shunem to Mount Carmel without letting her grief break through the surface. This is not easy. Human beings under the weight of grief typically do one of two things. They collapse inward, withdrawing into private devastation, or they cry outward, needing to share the pain so it does not rest on one person alone. Both responses are natural. Both are human, but the woman of Shunem did neither. She held the grief in silence, and she rode. She did not do this because she was disconnected from what had happened. She was completely connected to it, as her collapse at Elisha's feet clearly showed. She did it because, in the first moments after the child died, she made a decision about what to do with her grief. She decided to move, to act, to carry the weight of the loss until she reached the one person who might know what to do. This kind of strength is quiet. It does not look heroic from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a woman riding a donkey quickly across a stretch of land while telling people that everything is fine. But inside, it is something far more costly, a deliberate act of refusing to let grief make all the decisions before faith has had its say. She had built a room for a prophet. She had served him without asking for anything. She had received an impossible gift. She had loved that gift through the years the text simply describes with the words "the child grew." And now the gift was gone, but she was riding, and she was not yet willing to call it gone. There is a specific kind of faith described in this journey that theologians across centuries have struggled to name. It is not the faith of certainty because she did not know that Elisha could do anything. It is not the faith of calm acceptance because she was in anguish, as her behavior at his feet made clear. And it is not the faith of the simple or the naive because she was a woman of intelligence and spiritual perception who understood exactly what death meant. It is the faith of persistence, the faith that says, "I do not know what comes next, but I know the direction I should move, and I am moving in it. I will not stop until I have exhausted the possibilities that remain available to me." It is the faith that rides through uncertainty without resolving it. It is the faith that holds together the full weight of grief and the full weight of hope in the same heart. It refuses to let either cancel the other out. She reached Mount Carmel because she kept riding. She reached Elisha because she refused to stop for Gehazi. And when she finally reached him, she spoke her grief out loud. It was the only honest thing left to do. Section 8. Confrontation with the prophet. Elisha's response to her grief was immediate and practical. He called Gehazi and said, "Gird your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer him. When you reach the house, lay the staff on the face of the boy." There is something important in these instructions that can easily be missed. The staff was closely associated with the prophet's presence. It was a physical extension of his identity, something he had carried and touched. In the symbolic language of the ancient world, such an object represented authority and connection. To send the staff ahead was, in a sense, to send something of himself ahead. It was an attempt to act at a distance, to project the effect of his presence into a situation he had not yet reached in person. The instruction not to greet anyone was also significant. In the ancient Near East, greetings were not casual exchanges. They were formal social rituals that acknowledged relationship and status. To stop and greet someone meant entering a social obligation that would delay the journey and divide the focus. Elisha was telling Gehazi to move with absolute urgency and complete attention, without the small interruptions that ordinary travel gathers along the way. The speed and singular focus of the journey were not merely practical, they were part of the action itself. But then the woman spoke, and her words revealed the limits of this approach. She said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." This was not polite conversation. It was the declaration of someone who knew the proposed solution was not enough. She had come for Elisha, not for his staff. She had sought the man, not the instrument. With the same clear perception that had allowed her to recognize him as a man of God the first time she saw him passing through Shunem, she understood that whatever was needed in that room required Elisha himself. Not a representative object, not a representative servant. She would not leave him. And Elisha rose and went with her. In its quiet way, this moment is one of the most powerful in the entire account. She had been offered a substitute, and she refused it. Not with argument, not with accusation, but simply with the statement that she would not go without him. And her words were honored, because she was right. Her perception had been accurate from the beginning. From the moment she first saw Elisha passing through Shunem and recognized something most people would have missed. And it was accurate again now. The staff was not enough, and the servant was not enough. What was needed could only come from the one who had spoken the word that began this entire chain of events. So they began the journey back toward Shunem. The distance she had covered at urgent speed on the way out would now be traveled at the slower pace of walking. And ahead of them, Gehazi was already running with the staff. Section 9. The Failed Attempt. Gehazi reached the house first. He entered the room and laid the staff on the face of the boy, and nothing happened. There was no sound and no response. No breath returned. No warmth appeared beneath the child's cold skin. No movement, no stirring, no sign that the staff's presence had changed anything. Gehazi returned to meet Elisha and said, "The boy has not awakened." It is one of the quietest and most devastating sentences in the entire account. And it raises a question the text does not directly answer. Why did it not work? Many traditions of interpretation have suggested different explanations. Some point to the character of Gehazi, who would later be shown capable of serious moral failure. Others believe the attempt with the staff was never meant to succeed. In that reading, the failure shows that the solution would not be mechanical. It would not come from the use of a sacred object, even one belonging to a prophet. Others see in the failure a lesson about the limits of proxy faith, the impossibility of delegating an encounter between the divine and human desperation to someone who is not themselves the one who is desperate. Whatever the explanation, the text makes one thing clear. The failure did not discourage Elisha, and the woman who had refused to leave him had likely known from the beginning that the staff alone would not be enough. She had insisted on bringing the man himself for a reason, and now the man himself arrived. He entered the room and shut the door, just as the woman had shut the door earlier when she laid the child on the bed. In both cases, the closing of the door matters. It creates a private space, a boundary between the ordinary world outside and whatever is about to happen inside. She had closed the door on her grief, containing it in the room most closely associated with the prophet's presence, until she could bring that presence to confront it. Now he closed the door on what was about to happen next. Inside the room there would be only the prophet, the child, and the unseen source of the authority he carried. No witnesses, no audience, no performance. Section 10. The Prayer of Desperation. Elisha prayed to the Lord. That is the first action the text records after the door is closed, and the simplicity of it deserves attention. He prayed. He did not recite a formula. He did not pronounce a command. He did not perform a ritual sequence. He prayed because what was needed lay beyond the reach of his own power. And then he did something unusual. He lay down on the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. He stretched himself out over the small, cold body of the boy, the living over the dead, the warm over the cold, the breathing over the unbreathing, and the child's body grew warm. This act has been interpreted in many different ways across the history of commentary. Some have seen in it a practical dimension, in the attempt to transfer warmth and restore circulation, something resembling what a much later era would call resuscitation. Some have seen in it a purely symbolic act, the living prophet placing himself in intimate contact with death as a way of asserting the proximity of life to whatever death had taken. Others have seen in it the most literal expression of a theology that runs throughout the Hebrew prophetic tradition. The idea that the divine presence moves through embodied action, through the physical contact of one life reaching toward another, across a boundary that once seemed final. Whatever its meaning, the act was followed by signs. Elisha got up and walked back and forth in the room, pacing, a detail that carries something deeply human, the restlessness of waiting without knowing when or whether anything will change. And then he stretched himself over the child again, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. 7 sneezes, an odd and irreducibly physical detail in the middle of what might otherwise appear to be a purely spiritual account. 7, in the symbolic language of the Hebrew tradition, is the number of completion. The week completed, creation completed, something having reached its intended fullness. But here it is not merely a symbol, it is a child sneezing, a body re-engaging with the act of breathing, a respiratory system announcing its return to life in the most ordinary biological way. The miracle was announced by sneezing, not by trumpet, not by thunder, not by the dramatic language that extraordinary moments are usually expected to employ. It was announced by the sound of a child's body doing what children's bodies do. Only moments before that body had been doing none of the things bodies do, and now it did, 7 times, and then it opened its eyes. Section 11. Restoration. Elisha called Gehazi and told him to call the Shunammite woman. She came. He said, "Take up your son." She came in. She fell at his feet. She bowed herself to the ground. She took up her son, and she went out. That is the entire description. That is all the text gives us. No speech, no long expression of gratitude, no dramatic prayer of thanksgiving, no public declaration of what had happened or what she had learned. She came in, she fell, she bowed, she took her son, and she went out. The bowing to the ground is the posture of someone encountering something larger than language. It is the gesture the body makes when words are not enough, when the magnitude of what has happened makes every sentence feel too small. She did not speak because there was nothing to say that the gesture had not already expressed more completely. She took her son. This simple phrase completes an arc that began long before the child was ever born, long before the promise was spoken, long before the room was built and the meals were shared and the quiet perception formed. It began in a character that saw clearly and acted generously without demanding anything in return. It was prepared in years of faithful, ordinary living that came before any miracle appeared. It was tested in a grief that no one who had not been paying close attention would have known she carried. And it was completed in the quiet moment of a woman walking out of a room with the living child she had once laid there as a dead one. The miracle completed what faith had begun, not the other way around. The faith came first, the building came first, the seeing and the serving and the writing and the refusal to accept a substitute came first, and the miracle arrived in a space that faith had already prepared. Section 12. The spiritual architecture of this story. Every significant narrative carries within it not only the events it describes, but also the pattern of understanding those events are meant to reveal. The story of the woman of Shunem has been told and retold for thousands of years because it contains a particular architecture of spiritual insight. It speaks to something persistent in human experience, something that does not belong only to ancient Israel or to a single religious tradition. It speaks to loss, hope, grief, and the mysterious relationship between human action and divine response. The first element of this architecture is the principle that preparation precedes miracle. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect of the story. We often imagine miracles as sudden responses, divine answers that appear at the moment of deepest desperation when human resources have been exhausted. And miracles of that kind certainly exist within the tradition. But the miracle in this story does not arrive at the peak of desperation. It arrives in a life that had already been prepared for it, prepared by years of quiet generosity, by the building of a room that no one had asked for, and by service offered to a man of God before any blessing was received or even expected. The child was not given because his mother fell at Elisha's feet in need. The child was given because she had built a room, and the room was built because she had seen clearly. And that clarity was an expression of who she already was before the story began. This sequence matters. It suggests that preparation for the miraculous does not begin in the crisis that later demands it. It begins long before, in ordinary decisions made on ordinary days, in the attention we bring to small encounters, in generosity offered without calculation, in service given without expecting a return. The crisis reveals what that preparation has made possible, but the preparation must come first. The second element of this architecture is the principle that authentic faith includes lament. The woman of Shunem did not perform composure before Elisha. She fell at his feet and spoke her grief out loud. She said, "Did I ask for a son?" This is not the language of someone who has lifted themselves above their pain into a spiritual detachment that no longer feels the weight of loss. It is the language of someone who feels exactly how much this hurts and who brings that hurt directly into the encounter with the divine, rather than hiding it behind carefully arranged words. The Hebrew tradition that produced this story is full of this kind of lament. The Psalms are full of it. The book of Job is full of it. The great voices of the tradition speak their grief without polishing it first. Because the tradition understands that honest grief offered to God is itself a form of trust. The trust that the relationship can hold the truth of what is felt, even when that truth is not beautiful. She lamented honestly, and she was heard. The third element of this architecture is the principle that faith persists through silence. Between the moment the child was conceived and the moment the child died, the text compresses years into only a few sentences. The years of the child's growth, the years when the promise was quietly unfolding in ordinary ways. The toddler learning to walk, the small child learning to speak, the boy beginning to venture further from the house. All of this is described with almost no words. This is not carelessness on the part of the narrative. It is an observation about the nature of the miraculous in daily life. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The answered prayer becomes the background of living. The thing once desperately desired becomes simply the thing that is present, and its presence is no less real for being less astonishing than it once was. In the silence of those years, the woman simply lived faithfully, generous, attentive to the ordinary texture of a life that had been given back to her in a form she had not expected. She was not doing anything dramatic. She was simply being who she was, and being who she was turned out to be exactly what was needed when the crisis arrived. The fourth element of this architecture is the principle that persistence in prayer matters. Elisha prayed, then he acted, then he waited, then he acted again. He stretched himself over the child. He rose and walked. He returned and stretched himself over the child again, and then the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. This sequence, prayer, action, waiting, continued action, is not described as a failure of faith. It is simply what happened, which suggests that the process itself, the sustained and repeated engagement with the situation, was part of the miracle rather than evidence of its absence. This matters for anyone who has ever prayed once and not received what they hoped for. The text does not suggest that a single prayer exhausts the possibilities of faith. Persistence is not a weakness, but a participation in the unfolding of what is being asked for. The miracle arrived not through a single perfect moment, but through sustained, embodied, repeated engagement. And the fifth element, underlying all the others, is this. The God in this story is a God who restores what seemed permanently lost. The child was dead, not metaphorically dead, not merely ill or endangered. Dead, laid on a bed with the door closed, cold beneath the warm hands stretched out over him. There was no ambiguity in the mother's grief. The loss was real. And then he sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. What this story ultimately asserts is that the category of permanently lost is not always as final as it appears from within the experience of loss. Not because loss is unreal, the woman's grief was entirely real, but because the story insists that the ending has not yet been written when the middle is darkest. The closed room, the silent child. The mother riding across the landscape with grief in her chest and hope in her direction. These are not the final images the story gives us. They are the middle. They are the darkness before the 7 sneezes, before the opened eyes, before the words, "Take up your son." This is not a promise that every grief resolves in this life. The tradition is too honest to make that claim. Human history contains many losses that are never reversed in visible ways. But it is an assertion that reversal is possible, that what seems final sometimes is not, and that the faithful response to that possibility is to move toward hope with urgency, refusing to slow down for anything that cannot help. Section 13. The legacy of an unnamed woman. She does not appear again in the text after she walks out of the room with her living son. The story continues in the book of Second Kings. There are other accounts, other encounters, other events that follow this one chronologically, but she herself does not reappear until a brief mention much later in the narrative, in a context that tells us the family eventually left the land during a famine and returned after 7 years, at which point the king was miraculously predisposed to restore their property because Gehazi happened to be telling him about her at the exact moment she arrived to make her case. Even in this later appearance, she is identified only as the woman whose son Elisha restored to life. She is still unnamed, still defined by her actions and their consequences, rather than by a given name. This anonymity is, in a way, the most appropriate possible condition for the story she inhabits. Names individuate, specify, locate a person in a particular time and social context in ways that can make them feel distant from readers in other times and other contexts. But the unnamed woman of Shunem remains universally available. She can be anyone and can be recognized by anyone who has ever prepared for something without knowing what the preparation was for, who has ever served without calculating the return, who has ever ridden through their grief toward the only help that might remain available, refusing to slow down, refusing to accept the substitute, insisting on the real thing. She belongs to the tradition not simply as a historical individual located in the book of Second Kings of ancient Israel, but as an archetype, a figure through whom certain qualities of faith and character are demonstrated in a way that remains recognizable across any distance of time. The qualities themselves are worth naming clearly because they are not the dramatic qualities that often receive the most attention in the teaching of faith traditions. She was not a martyr. She was not an ascetic. She was not particularly dramatic in her piety. She did not perform her faith in ways that made it visible and admirable from the outside. She simply built a room. She simply told the truth about her grief. She simply kept writing. She simply refused to accept less than what she had come for. These are the qualities that prepared the miracle. Attentiveness, generosity without calculation, honest lament, persistent pursuit, the refusal to settle for insufficient substitutes, and the willingness to receive what arrived with the whole of herself rather than only the composed and acceptable portion. Most of the people who have ever loved well, serve quietly, maintain their faith in silence through seasons of waiting, and found restoration waiting on the other side of their most persistent grief are unnamed. They do not appear in lists of the great. They do not have monuments raised in their honor. They are, in the accounting of human history, the vast majority. The ones who built the rooms without knowing what the rooms were for, who kept the lamps burning in the upper chambers, who rode urgently in the direction of help before they had any assurance that help would arrive. She is all of them. She is the one the story chose to tell, speaking for all the others the story could not contain. Section 14. The room and what it means. Let us return one final time to the room. A bed, a table, a lamp, a chair. 4 things, simple, practical, complete. The minimum necessary to make a space genuinely hospitable. To give rest, to give a place for work, to give light, to give quiet stillness. The room was not elaborate. It was not a monument to the generosity that built it. It was a functional space designed with attention to actual need rather than impressive gesture. But it was permanent, and that detail sets it apart from the meal she had offered before. So from the passing hospitality of a traveler, welcomed at the table and then sent on his way. She built a room. She created a standing space, a place that would be there whenever Elisha returned, a physical expression of her commitment to his presence in her household that did not require repeated decisions or renewed invitations. The decision was made once in the building, and the room thereafter spoke for itself. This becomes a metaphor that extends far beyond its historical moment. What are the rooms we build for the things we recognize as significant? For the practices and the people and the orientations of attention that we understand to be connected to something larger than the immediate demands of daily life? How often do we offer meals, temporary, situational, easily withdrawn, when what is truly called for is the building of something permanent, a structural commitment rather than a decision made case by case? The woman of Shunem built a room because she perceived something real and acted on her perception with a commitment proportionate to the significance of what she had perceived. She did not wait to be asked. She did not wait for external pressure that made the building necessary. She saw something and she built something in the quiet confidence of someone whose perception could be trusted and whose character was already organized around acting on what had been seen. And the room became the place where her son was laid when he died. And the room became the place where her son was raised when the miracle came. The same space, the same four objects: bed, table, lamp, chair, could present in the room where the child was laid cold and still and the door was closed, and present in the room where the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The room built as an act of generosity became the theater of restoration. The space she had prepared for the man of God became the space where God moved. There is a theological intuition here that requires no formal theological language to understand. The places we prepare with genuine attention and authentic generosity often become the places where significant things happen. Not always, not inevitably, not as a mechanical guarantee that hospitality offered must produce the miracle desired. But there is a connection, a relationship between the quality of space prepared and the quality of what can occur within it that the story of the Shunammite woman makes visible in an unforgettable way. She prepared the space. The space became sacred, not because of a ceremony or a formal consecration, but because of the quality of intention that built it, the quality of presence that inhabited it, and the quality of faith that, in the most desperate moment imaginable, carried a dead child to that room, laid him there, and closed the door. The room was the first act of faith. Everything else followed from it. Section 15. It is well, the deepest meaning. She said, "It is well," 3 times in the narrative. She said it to her husband when she asked for the donkey and the servant. She said it to Gehazi when he ran to meet her on the road. And readers across centuries have heard in that repeated phrase something that goes beyond its immediate practical function as a way of deflecting questions she did not have time to answer. It as well becomes an act of faith spoken into the throat of catastrophe. It does not mean that everything is fine. She was not describing the situation as it appeared. It does not mean she was without pain. She was carrying the deepest pain the loss of a child can bring. It does not mean she had certainty. She was riding toward a man she hoped could help with no guarantee that he could. The deepest meaning of the phrase is closer to this: the last word has not yet been spoken. The story is not finished. The ending has not been written yet, and I refuse to write it prematurely. And so, while she moves toward whatever still has the power to change the situation, she refuses the language of finality. She will not speak the closing words while there is still road ahead of her and a direction in which she can ride. It is well becomes the declaration of someone who understands that the present moment is not the whole of reality, that what appears to be the end may not be the end, that the child on the bed with the door closed may not yet be the final chapter of the story, and the appropriate response to that possibility is to keep moving. There is a courage in those 3 words that is not immediately visible, until one understands what she was carrying when she spoke them. She was carrying the death of her child, the apparent collapse of the promise that had once given him to her, and the terror of approaching the prophet who had made that promise and confronting him with the evidence of its apparent failure. She carried all of that, and still she said, "It is well," not because it was already well, but because she refused to pronounce the final judgment before the final word had been spoken. This is perhaps the deepest spiritual posture the story teaches, not the joy of receiving the miracle that is easy, or at least easier to sustain, not the patience of waiting for the miracle to arrive that requires endurance, but the particular quality of courage this woman displayed. The deepest posture is this one, the refusal to speak the closing words when the story is still moving, the capacity to say it is well in the middle of what feels like the end. The faith that persists not in the absence of evidence, but in the explicit presence of evidence that seems to argue for the opposite conclusion. She said it is well with a dead child in the room behind her and a long road ahead of her, and no guarantee that what she was riding toward would make any difference at all. And it was. It was well. Not when she said it, not yet, but because she said it and kept riding and refused the proxy and fell at the prophet's feet and spoke her grief honestly and insisted on the man himself. Because of all of that, the word that seemed impossible became true. And when she walked out of the room with her living son in her arms, "It is well" was no longer an act of faith held against the evidence. It was simply the truth. Closing reflection, a night meditation for tired hearts. You are perhaps at the end of a long day. The world has asked a great deal of you, asked it without ceremony, without acknowledging that what was being requested was significant in the way that life tends to ask its most exhausting things, as though they were ordinary. And you have done what you could. You have moved through the hours with whatever quality of attention and presence you had available, which was probably not the quality you would have preferred, but was the quality you had. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole of what anyone can offer. The quality of presence that is actually available, not the quality that would be available in some hypothetical better version of the day. The woman of Shunem lived her faith in the small hours of small days. She did not live it in the dramatic hour of the miracle's arrival, though she was present for that too. She lived it in the decision to prepare a room for a traveling man she recognized as significant. She lived it in the regular meals offered without asking for return. She lived it in the honest conversation with her husband about what she perceived and what she wanted to do about it. She lived it in the grief she carried privately on the long mornings of the child's growing years, grief that had been organized into acceptance but never entirely dissolved. She lived it in the decision when the worst happened to close the door and saddle the donkey and ride. Every one of these acts was small. None of them, at the time it was being performed, was recognizable as faith in action. The building of the room looked like interior decorating, and the regular meals looked like hospitality. The quiet private grief looked like what it was, a woman who had wanted something and had not received it and had made peace with that. The writing looked like a mother going to find help for a sick child. None of it looked from the outside like the architecture of a miracle. And yet the miracles we are hoping for, the reversals we need in the situations that feel most irreversible, the moments of restoration that we are not sure are coming, these tend to find their way into lives that have been prepared to receive them. Not by dramatic acts of conspicuous piety, not by the performance of faith for the sake of an audience, but by the quiet, consistent, cumulative weight of ordinary faithfulness. The room built, the meal offered, the truth told, the direction maintained, the door closed with the certain faith that something real has been placed in that room and that the word spoken over it has not yet finished being true. You have, in the living of your life, been building rooms. Some of them you may not even recognize as rooms. Some of them you built without knowing what they were for, in the way the woman of Shunem built a room for a prophet without knowing that the room would one day receive the child the same prophet gave her. Some of them feel right now like empty spaces, spaces prepared for something that has not yet arrived, or for something that arrived and then was taken away before it could be fully received. The story of the Shunammite does not promise that every room will be filled in the way you hoped. It does not offer a mechanical guarantee that preparation produces the specific outcome you prepared for. Honest reading of any tradition requires acknowledging that some griefs are not reversed in this life, that some rooms remain empty in ways that break the heart, that faith does not always produce the sneezing 7 times and the opening of eyes that you rode across the landscape hoping for. But it does offer this: the quality of character that prepared the space matters. The generosity extended without calculation matters. The honesty of the lament matters. The refusal to accept the proxy when the real thing is what is needed matters too. The writing itself, the direction of the movement, even when the destination is uncertain. The 3 words spoken into the middle of what seems like the end: it is well. These things matter in ways that are not always immediately visible, but are real. And sometimes, not always, not mechanically, not as a reward that can be reliably predicted. Sometimes the child opens his eyes. Sometimes the word spoken years ago in an open doorway turns out to still be true. Sometimes the room built in an act of quiet generosity becomes the room where the most important thing happens. And sometimes, in the ordinary middle of an ordinary night, having laid down whatever the day has left you carrying, the most faithful thing available is to close your own eyes in the trust that it is well, that the story is still moving, that the last word has not been spoken, that whatever is most real in your life is being held in hands larger than the ones that fear currently fills, and that the direction you are moving, even when you cannot see the destination, is the right direction. Let the room you have built hold you tonight. Let the faith that prepared the way trust the way. Let the words spoken over your life continue to be true in the dark hours where its truth is doing its deepest work. It is well. Rest now. You have ridden far enough for today. Extended theological meditation. What Elisha prayed and why it matters. There is a single sentence in the narrative that stands above all the others in terms of what it reveals about the nature of the encounter taking place in the upper room. Elisha prayed to the Lord. He shut the door, he stood before the child, and he prayed. This tells us something essential about how the prophetic tradition understood the relationship between human action and divine response. Elisha was, by the account of the text, an extraordinarily gifted figure, someone through whom water was made drinkable, through whom a widow's oil multiplied until there were no more jars to fill, through whom armies were blinded and enemies were fed and iron floated on the surface of water. He was not an ordinary man performing ordinary tasks. He was someone operating in a distinct register of human possibility, gifted with perception and capacity that exceeded what could be explained by training or natural talent alone. And yet in this room, before this child, his first act was prayer, not confidence, not the authoritative declaration of a master working within his area of expertise. Prayer, which is the acknowledgement that what is needed exceeds what the one praying can supply, that the source of whatever is about to happen is not located within the person doing the asking, but within something to which the person doing the asking is turning. This is humility of a very specific and instructive kind. It is not the false humility that performs inadequacy in order to be reassured of competence. It is the real humility of someone who understands precisely what they can and cannot do, and who, having reached the limit of what they can do, turns clearly and without drama toward the source of what they cannot. The lying over the child that followed the prayer, that physical embodied act of stretching himself over the small cold body, was not the prayer. It was the action that followed from the prayer, the physical expression of the orientation the prayer had established. He prayed first, he acted second. The prayer was not a ritual that preceded the real work. The prayer was the essential act, and the physical action was its embodied extension. This sequence, prayer, then action, orientation, then movement, acknowledgement of the source, then expression of the gift, appears throughout the Hebrew prophetic tradition as a kind of grammar of divine encounter. The action matters. The physical engagement matters. The sustained, repeated, embodied commitment to the situation matters. But none of it is the cause of what happens. It is the vehicle through which the cause moves, and the cause is accessed first in prayer. Elisha lay over the child, and the child grew warm. He got up and paced. He lay over the child again. The child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. And the rabbis who studied this text across the centuries noted the parallel between Elisha's action here and Elijah's action in the raising of the widow of Zarephath's son in the first book of Kings. The same basic structure appears in both accounts. The dead child, a prophet who prays and performs a physical act of lying over the body, a gradual restoration. The repetition across 2 prophetic figures separated by a generation is not accidental. It suggests a tradition of practice, a taught approach to this most desperate of situations, passed from Elijah to Elisha, along with the double portion of the Spirit that Elisha had asked for and received. 7 sneezes. The number 7 appears throughout the Hebrew scriptures as the marker of completion, the 7th day on which creation rested, the 7-day cycles of feast and fast, the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle. Here the 7 sneezes carry the weight of that symbol, the child's body completing its return to life in 7 discrete, involuntary, entirely biological acts of respiration. The sacred number expressed not in a ceremony, but in a sneeze. Completion arriving not in a grand gesture, but in the most ordinary physical response of a body that has, against all expectation, resumed the act of being alive. And then the eyes opened, which is the most intimate of the signs of life, the body's own announcement that consciousness has returned, that the interior life which makes a person rather than a body is once again present and looking out through the windows that connect it to the world. The child's eyes opened, and whatever Elisha saw in that moment, whatever the meeting of his eyes with the child's living eyes communicated across the space of the room in which he had prayed and waited and acted again, that moment is not described by the text at all. The text moves immediately to the next practical action. Elisha calling Gehazi to bring the woman. She came, he said, "Take up your son." She fell. She bowed. She took him and went out. The text moves on. The miracle is complete. The meaning continues. Supplemental reflection on Gehazi and the limits of proxy faith. The figure of Gehazi occupies an interesting position in this account, and his role in the narrative illuminates something important about the nature of what was required. Gehazi was Elisha's servant, his assistant, his companion in the day-to-day logistics of the prophetic life. He is a regular presence in the accounts of Elisha's ministry, sometimes helpful, sometimes inadequate, and in at least one other account in the book of 2 Kings, revealed as capable of significant moral failure. He was a person in close proximity to something extraordinary without being himself extraordinary. When the woman arrived and fell at Elisha's feet, It was Gehazi who moved to push her away, the protective instinct of a servant whose job was to manage his master's access and guard his time. And it was Elisha who stopped him, recognizing with the perception that characterized the prophetic consciousness that this was not a moment for managing social protocol. When Elisha sent Gehazi ahead with the staff, the intention was not careless. The distance between Mount Carmel and Shunem was real, and the urgency was real. If the staff could accomplish what needed to be accomplished, the suffering of the mother would be reduced by the time it would otherwise take to travel. The gesture was sincere, but the gesture was insufficient. The staff was an object. Objects can carry symbolic meaning, can serve as vehicles of attention and intention, but they cannot pray, they cannot grieve, they cannot stretch themselves out in the full embodied commitment of a living person reaching toward what they cannot do alone. The miracle required a person. It required prayer. It required the sustained embodied engagement of someone who had access to something the staff did not. And the woman of Shunem understood this. She insisted on the man. She refused the object. Her refusal was theologically correct, not because objects have no place in the tradition, but because in this moment the situation required presence rather than substitution. Final words for the sleepless and the waiting. There are people who will listen to this story tonight who are themselves in the middle of something that feels like the closed door. They have received something, a hope, a relationship, a dream, a healing, and then it was taken away suddenly, without preparation, in the way a child collapsed in the field and was carried back with the words, "My head, my head." And they are carrying it the way she carried it, with a composed surface, saying some version of "it is well," while riding toward the only direction that seems to offer hope. This story does not deny the exhaustion of that ride. It does not deny the grief beneath the surface. It does not say that falling at the feet and asking why is a failure of faith. She fell. She spoke her grief honestly. She was heard. These are not contradictions. They are the same faith at different moments of its expression. And the story ends simply, the child opened his eyes. The door was opened. The woman who built the room was called back to receive what she had once carried there. She took up her son, simple, declarative, complete. Tonight, wherever you are in the arc of your own story, whatever closed door you are sitting before, or whatever long road you are still riding, you are not yet at the last word. The last word has not been spoken. And in the darkness before the morning, that is enough. That is the whole of what is needed. It is well. Close your eyes. The room is prepared. The lamp is burning. Rest.